in this video we're going to be talking about how to survive high ascensions on silent. So in the first part, we talked about how to get through Act 1 and 2. So there's a couple big principles to follow to get through Act 1 and 2 on higher ascensions. So you don't want to remove more than one strike early before you get extra damage on the silent, because that can lead you to suffer and lose against the Lagavulin, the Gremlin Knob, and a lot of the Act 2 enemies as well. So you want to keep up the damage so you can face those elites. You also want to seek out lots of hallway fights in Act 1. This can help you to get more opportunities to get the big damage cards and some of the really nice cards that Silent can pick up between the rares and the uncommons. But you do not want to skip those big damage cards early because they make those fights against things like Lagavulin and the Gremlin Knob much easier. You also don't want to be afraid to get low on health during Act 1 and going into the first boss. Some of the bosses, except for Slime Boss, are pretty weak, and you can actually take them on even at low health going into that fight. So try to greed out a little bit more in Act 1, go for more elites, go for more smithing at the bonfires. Um, and yeah, I would say in general, aim for 1 to 2 elites in Act 1. If you can even beat one elite, the chances of getting a rare card go up, you get the extra relic, and it just makes the whole run give you a lot more luck um, with the card opportunities. And then you want to look for very high value cards like Footwork Catalyst, Tactician Reflex during Act 1. Try not to go too hard with things like Nightmare and Bullet Time if you don't have the synergies yet, but really strong cards like Footwork Catalyst, those are the ones you want to look for right off the bat. And then another thing, a lot of people tend to go for poison decks in kind of the mid-level ascensions, but don't be afraid to go for a Shiv deck, especially if you pick up an accuracy or the boot relic, because Shiv decks can actually end up working out very well on high ascensions. And then going into Act 2, you want to be a little bit more cautious than in Act 1. Maybe go for more of the question mark spaces. Maybe try not to face too many elites unless you already have a deck that's going to destroy some of those elites. Like, for example, those AoE elites like Gremlin Leader and the Taskmaster are going to be weaker to things like Corpse Explosion. Um, but in general, just be more cautious. Try to get to the second boss with a lot of health, at least over half, because some of those big attacks can really mess you up on one single turn if you don't have much health left. And if you have big damage already going into Act 2, try to go for some of those elites as well, because you can kind of get ahead of the curve the more elites you're able to fight safely. It just makes those card draws better, gives you the extra relics, and you can kind of just win more, which could be the difference maker going into Act 3. And yeah, try to be healthy going into the Act 2 boss, and try to start finding an underlying deck theme during Act 2, preferably towards the beginning of Act 2, something that's going to accelerate your deck. So you want to improve your block maybe with something like Footwork or Wraith Form. You want to get that poison stacking going with something like Catalyst. A discard deck can be really nasty if you can get it going with things like Tactician, Reflex, and lots of discarding cards. Or an accuracy deck with Shivs can be really big if you can get a couple of those accuracies in that deck. And also, another thing to know, especially after Ascension 17, Act 2 elites can actually sometimes be easier than the normal hallway fights in Act 2. So if you might find that the Chosen's going to do 31 damage to you, but if you're able to just knock out the Taskmaster really fast, then you're not actually going to take as much damage from the Taskmaster. Or, for example, if you can destroy those minions from the Gremlin Leader, then the Gremlin Leader is only doing 30. And that's less than the Chosen ends up doing on those higher ascensions. So some of those elites are actually easier in certain situations. All right, so let's get into how to take on Act 3. So if we look at some of the choices that I've made in this run, you can kind of see some of the lessons that I learned from my first 4 runs. And this is what's going to help me survive Acts 1 and 2 in this run. So I went for the dagger throw early to up my damage numbers. Um, and I got some good block, which, is kind of luck getting the footwork. So this kind of leads into some of the big principles of prepping for Act 3. So the number one thing is to do big damage. You want to do as much damage as quickly as possible. And then if you go into Act 3 and especially going onto the heart, you're also going to want to have good block. But that's sort of a secondary goal, I would say, especially if with silent, because you can get the intangible to sort of be the block for you. There's a couple big principles to follow when you're trying to choose good cards to scale your deck up. The first thing is you don't want to force a synergy that isn't already there unless you're basically in a desperate situation. You don't think you're going to make it through the next boss. So if you're looking at a card like Nightmare, but you don't actually have a good card to use Nightmare on yet, then it's probably best just to skip the Nightmare, because that's going to end up being more of a curse than anything else. But there's a lot of good cards, especially on the silent, that are good regardless of whether they're synergizing with something. So these generally are going to be your drawing cards and your discarding cards. So we talked about Dagger Throw already, but Dagger Throw, it draws 1 card and it discards 1 card. So it already is good for your deck because it's cycling your deck. It's doing more damage than a strike as well. So this is what I'm talking about when I talk about high value cards. These are the cards that can set you up for success down the line while still being good right off the bat. And then once you've filled up your deck with some of these nicer cards like a Dagger Throw, maybe you throw in a Prepared, you get something like Glass Knife, a Blade Dance. These are the types of things where these cards are good to begin with on their own. And then if you can get those synergizing cards, like with a discard deck, you want to get the Reflex, the Tactician, the Sneaky Strike. All of those you can then get later on because you set up your synergy safely. You don't want to force the synergy if you don't already have it, but you do want to kind of smooth into those synergies with some of these mid-ground cards early on. If you think that discard is a negative, it's absolutely the opposite. It's a total positive. Very few situations come by where the discard is a negative. There's even a relic for silent, the Hovering Kite, which basically gives you a free energy every turn that you discard. So if you go for a discard deck and you get that Hovering Kite, you basically just get a completely free energy every single turn. Because oftentimes you're not even going to be able to play all of the cards in your hand. So discarding one of them isn't a big deal. Also, another big card that can't be overlooked is Glass Knife. This is a card that's going to do 24 damage when upgraded, 16 when not upgraded, and it's only a 1 cost card. So this is something that basically any deck on silent is going to want. It gives you a big boost of damage for a really, really low cost, and upgrading it is amazing. And then later on down the line, cards that maybe don't look so great can become a lot better, like Bane Plus can do 20 damage for 1 cost. So these are the big damage cards that you are really going to need going towards the Act 3 boss to be able to knock them down in a limited number of turns. Adrenaline is another card that will work with pretty much any deck. Predator is another great card that works with any deck. Anything that's drawing generally is going to work pretty well. A lot of those Act 3 bosses are non-stop attacking. They're scaling at the same time, most of them. And basically you have to get rid of them in a very small amount of turns because they're going to overwhelm you with damage. So these big 20-ish damage cards are big saviors going into the Act 3 boss fight. just because Silent has a lot of zero cost cards, Silent has a lot of discard, drawing, playing lots of cards per turn types of decks, and Time Eater really takes advantage of those. Also, just the base damage and the base block of the cards that Silent has to choose from aren't very high, and these are the exact types of things that Time Eater can take advantage of. Basically, you want to get that high damage going. You want to get that fast scaling up of damage going because a lot of the time you're going to have to face that Time Eater, and especially going into Ascension 20 where there's two Act 3 bosses to face, you're more often than not going to run into the Time Eater. So that makes it all the more important to go for those big damage one cost cards whenever you can. So these are the principles of choosing a good card: synergy and immediate raw power. Every single deck on the higher Ascensions needs that immediate raw power because without it, the synergies aren't strong enough. And if you can get a card like Dagger Throw, for example, that is raw power going into a synergy down the line, that can be a big, big way to ensure success going through every single act. So for my 6th attempt overall, I started off with some pretty good damage cards. Again, I got the Storm of Steel early, and this is a card that's very strong right off the bat. You can get a whole lot of shivs, especially if you get it on the first turn, and just do really big damage, but it also synergizes really well with reflex, and it's good with accuracy. It's good with envenom. It's one of those cards that has big damage right off the bat and can synergize later. So this is one of the high value early game cards. And then I also picked up Envenom. So Envenom, it's a 2-cost power. You're only applying 1 poison per hit. So on its own, it's not a very strong card, so not a big power card early on. But if you already have the tools to create a synergy with it, then it's actually pretty good to take. If you have a Shiv deck where you're playing lots of Shivs, you got Riddle with Holes, you got that Storm of Steel, those all can be big with Envenom. The colorless card Sadistic Nature works very, very well with Envenom. So a couple more principles on setting up a deck to survive Act 3. You want to recognize super high value cards. So these are cards that are both good on their own and they synergize well with other cards. So Adrenaline is like the biggest example of this because every deck pretty much wants draw and wants more energy. Storm of Steel, that's really strong on its own and then can synergize later on. Dagger Throw is another one that I've been mentioning. And then there's other ones like Blade Dance, which is a 12 damage for 1 cost, 1 energy. You got Corpse Explosion, which can turn a poison deck into AoE or turn any deck into AoE. You don't even need other types of poison. It's a really nasty card for any deck to add some AoE to it. And then Glass Knife, great attack on its own. Footwork is a great power card all on its own. These are the super high value cards you want to look out for. Early on is when you want to get those cards that are good on their own but don't necessarily have great synergies. And then later on, you have to think about what synergies your deck already is capable of getting if you just get one more card. So let's say I have a Shiv deck, then accuracy is going to be good later on. So accuracy is not good on its own, but with the synergy of already having a Shiv deck, I can pick up that accuracy later on. And then when looking at what relics you want to choose, it's always going to be a case-by-case and run-by-run basis, but strongly consider the downsides of some of the boss relics like Philosopher's Stone, Coffee Dripper, Velvet Choker, Ectoplasm, Runic Dome, Snecko Eye. Remember that these downsides can be run-ending depending on how much they're going to hurt your deck. Sometimes you can get away with these downsides if you really need the energy, but just keep it in mind. And also, there are some relics that are a lot weaker that don't really help much at all. And the opportunity cost of taking these relics can be the difference between winning and losing the run. So, for example, Tiny House, doesn't give a lot of value on its own. So if there's something that's a little bit better, those might actually be providing you more value that could be the difference maker. And always look for synergies if you're buying relics at the shop as well. Look at each relic individually and think, okay, does this help my deck? So let's say you have a big damage card like Glass Knife. Maybe Pen Nib can be a big relic to buy to occasionally get that big hit off. Akabiko works very, very well with the silent on some of the multi-hit moves like Riddle with Holes and Skewer. So Shiv decks can work very well with something like Kunai or Shuriken because you're playing a lot of individual attacks. And then with a poison deck, something like Art of War can be really huge if you're rarely playing attacks to have more energy basically every single turn. So for this attempt, I end up picking up a Wraith form fairly early on. And Wraith form is one of the best cards in the game for Silent. It works with pretty much any deck, and basically the idea is the goal is already to win every single fight in about 5 turns or less. If you can be intangible for 3 of those turns, which is what Wraith form plus provides, you can basically never have to play block cards. And this opens you up to use more of your other cards, your attack cards, and just constantly attack. So not only are you getting the reduced damage, but you're actually going to be able to play more energy on future turns, which offsets the cost of the 3-cost power. So Wraith form is possibly the most high value card that Silent can pick up. There's also a question mark event in Act 3 where you can duplicate your card. There's also the relic Dolly's Mirror where you can duplicate a card. So these are ways to get more Wraith forms and basically turn even a really bad run into an easy win. And try to get that Wraith form upgraded as soon as possible as well. Okay. Another big thing you want to do prepping for Act 3, you want to aim with the goal of winning fights very quickly, or as soon as possible. But against every battle, the quicker you can end it, the less often the enemy is going to be able to hit you for their big hits. So this means you need to find a way to deal big damage fast. Catalyst is one of the easiest ways to get your damage numbers up. Accuracy can also do this. There's also special relic synergies like Akabiko. And this brings me to another card that can really up your damage. If you're going for any sort of attack deck, Terror is a huge card. To amplify your damage by 1.5 non-stop is better than a lot of the strength cards that you can find for Ironclad, for example. Another big thing is that the Apparition event is a lot better than most people think. So seriously consider taking them. Even the downside of losing a lot of HP. Losing a bunch of max HP isn't bad if you're never taking damage anymore in any of the fights. But be aware that on these higher Ascensions, you only gain 3 Apparitions instead of 5. Having a fast deck is a big way to win fights faster. If you can get super high value cards and then draw them more and more often, that's a big way to win. And so the deck doesn't have to necessarily have a small amount of cards. You just need to be able to draw and play your cards as quickly as possible. So this is how draw cards can, in essence, thin out a deck. Calculated Gamble and Adrenaline are 2 really big cards that are able to do this because it can help you cycle to those higher value cards faster. So if your deck becomes too offensive, there's not enough block, you can end up very easily losing at the Act 3 bosses because they all tend to do big damage almost every single turn. But with Intangible, that basically gives you free extra turns to do what you want. So Intangible becomes a huge, huge boost for basically any Silent deck, and Wraith form might be the best card to take. Okay, so these are the tips to survive all 3 acts as Silent in higher Ascension levels. If you enjoyed, please leave a like, subscribe, and if there's anything you liked or didn't like, leave a comment and let me know so I can improve my videos in the future. Thank you for watching.